Okie dokie. Don't mind any of these contraptions. They're actually nothing. They're really for the real monk at 11 o'clock when he starts his Vietnamese lecture, and it's for the Vietnamese community. This is just the setup up to this point, so don't worry about that. Okay, so welcome. I'm seeing a lot of new faces, so hello, and some old faces. And then usually a couple of people will join us right after, in like 5 minutes time. My name's Long. Just to give you guys some background about who I am, I've been doing this for like the past 3 years. I told the monk, you know what? Well, because this is primarily a Vietnamese temple, and he normally lectures in Vietnamese. And I asked him, hey, can you find somebody to do some English lectures of Buddhism? Because, you know, as the kids are growing up in America,
can you pass me my person?
Yeah, they can't understand anything. And then he told me, that's a great idea. Why don't you do it? So I was voluntold to do this by the monk himself. So unfortunately, that's why I'm here. All right. As always, traditionally, the way that we start is we're going to put in 5 minutes of just an attempt at meditation and putting in the mindfulness practice. So I'll set the timer, and I'll guide you guys through it. Yeah. So whenever you guys are ready, just go ahead and close your eyes. Straighten up your bodies, and take deep breaths in. Take a breath in through your nose, and out through your mouths. And a couple of things to remind you guys. Mindfulness practice is not about the ability to focus for a really, really long time. It's really about how often can you refocus yourself when your thoughts are wandering, as they inevitably do. So you have two options. You could either focus on your breath and trace this path into your body and out of your body, up your nose, into your lungs, and out through your mouths. So that's focusing on the inside of your body. Or you could focus on the outside of your body. Despite the noises that you hear around you, focus on it. Without judgment, without feelings or emotions, just listen to it. We have 2 minutes left. got about 30 seconds left. So start familiarizing yourselves with the sounds and noise of the room around you. Start feeling yourself being grounded on whatever you're sitting on. Take your last deep breath in. And whenever you're ready, you can feel free to open up your eyes and join us here in the present moment. Okay, awesome. Also, just to ground us, today's a big holiday, so people may come in and out from time to time. You know, they're either going to be putting fruits down, praying, bowing, prostrating, doing the likes. So it's part normal, okay? Okay, so let me see if I should give context or not. No, it's not. I'm just gonna go straight into this. So there's a Vietnamese word that I was talking to the people from yesterday. It's the word in Vietnamese is tu, right? And it's just referring to like just putting in the practice of like showing up to temple and all of that stuff. But I couldn't necessarily find like the English translation for that word. And usually, you know, when you have a dictionary, there's a direct one-to-one translation, right? But sometimes, you know, it's a big concept, right? And so the best word that I found for like the work that you guys do now and what like the people who show up at temple do is they're basically cultivating, right? They're putting in cultivation, okay? And the question, you know, and so the idea is this, right? Especially with seeds, right? First off, the Buddha said this. He said that the seed of Buddhahood is within every single person, okay? It's just, it takes time for you to actually cultivate it to achieve the, you know, wisdom to be able to access it, okay? So, and it makes sense when you think about everyday life, right? You think about seeds. Seeds don't be, you know, a big tree doesn't start off as a tree. It starts off as a seed, right? And it needs water, it needs dirt, it needs soil, it needs sunlight, and it needs time, right? And the conditions have to be right before it actually germinates, okay? And the other thing, the opposite is true too. When you have an uncultivated seed, what happens to it? It just dies, right? Over time, it dies. Like, and so the idea is, especially with these lectures, right? The more that you show up, the more that you're giving your mind conditions for itself to germinate. That's A. And then B, over time, you know, you don't become enlightened right away. Like, that's impossible, right? It's just over time, the stronger your roots get and the more deeper they are into the soil. When you have roots, when you have foundations, and you nourish it over time, then that's the path to enlightenment, right? Or the path to wisdom, at least, okay? And so that's the point of all of this, all these lectures and stuff like that. So today, I wanted to talk about the idea of attachment, right? And basically, this idea is this, okay? The whole thing that a lot of Buddhism preaches is basically about having no attachment. And to some extent, no attachment is liberation, okay? And I'm going to explain all of this in a second. But, so the big three within Buddhism of like, I guess you could call it like sins or whatever, but it's the big three roots of evil. It's basically greed, which is attachment, anger, and then also ignorance, right? And of course, greed and attachment comes from ignorance, because if you lack the wisdom or lack the insight, then of course it's a natural human tendency to be attached to things, okay? And the idea is that attachment creates a mental prison, okay? So let's dive into this very quickly, right? And we'll explore like, okay, attachments to what, right? First thing I could think about is attachment to bad things, right? Tragedies, past action, etc., right? Oftentimes, these things they play back in our minds, right? And to some extent, they create a little bit of suffering within ourselves, okay? And so it's precisely because we lack this inability to let go of the past that it comes back to haunt us over and over again, right? So of those big three things, the greed, anger, and ignorance, those big three things are always constantly leading to our suffering. And so the whole point of Buddhism is, what's the pathway out of suffering, okay? And so in this conversation, we're talking about, okay, attachment to like past tragedies and stuff like that. It's temporal in the sense that like you're not living in the present moment, and so these negative thoughts come and attack you over and over again, right? And they put you in a space that ultimately you're feeling suffering from, okay? That's the first thing, right? Attachment to like bad things. The second thing is attachment to anything, right? Creates two things. It creates emotions, especially in the past, and those emotions create narratives that play back. And these narratives feed back into the emotions as well, okay? And so ultimately, the end result of all of this is that attachment creates a lot of suffering, okay? But there's a nuance in this, which is, yes, the past things have happened to you, right? And yes, to some extent, you want to acknowledge it. But the nuance point is you don't want to dwell on it, because it's precisely the dwelling that's creating the level of suffering within us, okay? So that's the idea behind it. So that's the first, like, very apparent thing. Like, don't be attached to bad things. Don't be attached to things that have happened in your past, right? And the idea is don't become a victim of your circumstances. Yes, whatever your past life is may have led you to this point right here. But that shouldn't define how your future is, right? You have the locus of control within you, so you shouldn't be a victim of your circumstances. That's A. Now let's talk about the other thing, the other side, right? It's easy to see like, oh, okay, let's let go of bad things in our lives, in our past lives. What about good things in our lives, right? And there's plenty of things to be attached to, right? Like nowadays in modern society, right? People are attached to, and this is what fuels greed, right? They're attached to their salary. They're attached to their status. They're attached to the cars that they drive, the houses that they live in. They're attached to who they know, right? And those are considered good things in our society. The problem is when it becomes a level of attachment to those things. And your ego, right? Your sense of who you are gets too attached to those things. And so for some people, like for example, let's just say fashion and clothing, they're so attached to it, right? It literally, what they wear defines who they are. Now, to some extent, that might be a good thing, but according to Buddhism, not so much, because to some extent, who are you once you lose your clothing, right? So who are you once once you get into a car accident and you can't drive that Ferrari anymore, right? And so that creates a certain level of suffering as well, right? And within Buddhism, the emphasis is that all things are impermanent, right? And so a lot of the times, the good things that we perceive, the things that we perceive as good, they're often impermanent, and we get so attached to them that ultimately they create a level of suffering, right? So just merely engaging in this dialogue allows you to acknowledge, oh yeah, okay, or begin to at least have insights to the fact that it's good to have these things, and it's good to appreciate what you have. At the same time, you shouldn't necessarily be attached to it, right? And that's the point of this, okay? Then I had a interesting thing about attachment to like future thoughts, right? There's a fine balance between setting goals for yourself, right? And then also being delusional, right? And it's a couple things, because how often? Well, I mean, raise your hand if this is true for you. How often have you thought about like winning the lottery? Yeah. Me too. So I'm not out of this. No, you haven't thought about it, really? Maybe this thought will creep into you, like when you're like trying to pay for rent and car and all those things, right? Until then, like when you're in the real adulthood life, okay? And so the nuance is this, right? Which is that it's okay to dream, but try not to be delusional. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this idea of manifesting, right? It's like you have to set your sight on goals. Like if you want to live in a big, nice house one day, then you want to manifest that, right? But the limit to manifestation is that some people have often just manifested without putting in the work, right? And so it kind of, that's where the critics are actually trying to attack the idea of like, manifesting without work, what's the point of that, right? And so here's the thing. It's okay to dream, but you can't be attached to future thoughts, things that you want in the future. And the question is, why is that? Because what it creates is a lens for you to look at what you don't have. And that, to some extent, creates a level of suffering, right? And a level of unhappiness. Because let's just say you drive a Toyota and you wish you had that Lexus, right? Or the Mercedes. Now it's creating that like want, that desire, and you'll never be happy, right? And once you get that Lexus, then you want the next latest car, right? And once you get that that nice like 2-bedroom house, then you want a 3-bedroom and a 4-bedroom house, right? And so attachment to like future desires, too much attachment to it, is going to lead you to have a deficit lens. And then you don't actually cultivate gratitude of what you have and where you are in this present moment, right? And so that's like the other danger of attachment, especially to the future self, okay? Here's my last piece that I want to talk about, which is attachments to words, perceptions, ego, and the self, okay? So oftentimes, right, let me step back here. When we meditate, right, the goal is not to be asleep, but the goal is also to cultivate hyper-focus, but not entertain thoughts, okay? So really, it's the challenge is, can you sit still with yourself and not focus on thoughts, or not let thoughts run your mind, okay? And the problem is the way that the mind works. It's constantly thinking, right? And oftentimes, the language part of our brain, right? And I've had a deeper lecture on this before, but the left side of our brain, physiologically, controls the language center, right? And when you have language, the start of language, it's the start of creating suffering. Why? Well, let's trace the path real quickly, right? When you're equipped with language, even as a baby, right? You see that little baby running around, right? Eventually, he's going to learn distinction, right? He's going to learn yes from no, black from white, etc., right? And then, from distinction, he's going to learn judgment, right? He's going to learn that chocolate is better than vanilla, right? Red is nicer than blue, etc., okay? So, and then from judgment, right, he's going to learn to construct narratives as well. And this becomes the source of a lot of suffering. Because a lot of the times, narratives are not true, right? It's the stuff that's in our minds that we project out into the world, right? And the unfortunate part is that the way that our minds work, we become attached to certain narratives that the mind constructs without it necessarily being true. Whether it's narratives about somebody right before you, or a narrative about the past, a narrative about the future, right? And that level of attachment, that level of dwelling, actually creates the suffering that we feel within us, okay? So, and I want to give you two examples real quick. Yes, just last week I was talking to this Vietnamese man. He's been in the Vietnamese community for a long time. He attends this temple, right? He was talking to another guy about like how there's this Vietnamese person here who talks about how he has so much success in America, but it was all thanks to the communist government that got him there, right? And then this man was from the South Vietnamese side. So just a little bit of history. You know, the South and the North fought. Obviously, the North belonged to communists, and then the South belonged to the American side. But he was upset with this guy who was thanking the communist government for giving him the opportunity to come to America to like become all successful. He was upset with this guy because for merely political reasons, he said, like, look, the communist government created all this suffering. They sent all these boat people out into sea, and they all died. So how can you go about thanking the communist government, et cetera, right? And I asked the guy, why is one person's words creating all this level of suffering within you? Like, why is this guy's opinion even relevant? You know, why does it, you know, and mind you, the Vietnam War ended in 1975. So we're talking about like over 50 years, and he's still attached and holding on to like political ideals, right? And so one person says this one statement, and now he's triggered, and he's like talking to this other guy about like, oh my God, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I asked him, why is this, you know, I challenged him to say like, why are you letting this negativity affect you? Can you, and the challenge is, can you just let it go, you know? And understand that, like, it's precisely the dwelling of and attachment to other people's words that creates suffering. But ultimately, learning to let go is your own choice as well, right? And so, often, and the other thing that I try to tell, so I'm a high school teacher, right? I teach in the South Bronx in a charter school. And a lot of the times, my advice to the children is, well, I tell them my singular advice, which is, no one cares, okay? And I use that as a joke sometimes. I usually ask them like, hey, when's your birthday? And then they'll be like, January 1st. And I'll be like, no one cares. It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of mean, but it's hilarious too. But what I'm trying to point to them, well, I try to be funny, but I tell them that like, a lot of the times, the big drama, especially in high school, gets created because one person decided to start something, to say something, and then because their ego and who they are is attached to that drama, it begins a larger thing, right? And even like just to start like slights, like just the way that somebody looks at them, starts big drama, and then all of a sudden it escalates to a giant fight, you know, like fist fights, all over whatever. And that's because all that level of suffering is created by just like people just not being able to let go and say, wait a minute, this might not be real. I'm not going to entertain it. I shouldn't even care about it, right? And yeah, I tell like, and oftentimes when I'm working with some of these scholars, this level of suffering is so evident, especially when somebody has said something to them and they're so shook, they're so angry, they're so ready to like engage. And I tell them, you have to learn how to be a water bottle as opposed to a soda bottle, right? Because the thing with, you know, a water bottle is if you shake it up, it's still still, it's still calm. Whereas with a soda bottle, you shake it up, it pops, right? And that's exactly where they are at. And so it's evident that they're lacking that wisdom to be able to understand, like, wait a minute, I shouldn't be attached to this. I should learn how to let go of these things, okay? So now I want to transition to a question that she asked me a long time ago, right? Maybe a couple weeks ago, which is, aren't we all, to some extent, attached to achieving enlightenment? Aren't the people who work here at the temple the people who donate fruits? attached to getting merits? Or the people who work downstairs in the kitchen, aren't they attached to getting good deeds or whatever, right? And it's a great question, right? And so there's an answer to it. And there's a very elegant answer to this as well, right? And so in the text, which is the Diamond Sutra, right? Which is like one of the sutras that's like conversations between the Buddha and his attendants. The Buddha says this, right? Blessing and virtues for a bodhisattva does not occurs when a bodhisattva does not dwell in marks when he gives. A bodhisattva who does not dwell in marks when he gives. What does that mean? Okay. If you are doing good deeds, right? Donations, volunteering your time, and counting it in your mind, then then it's not necessarily good, right? But then the merits that you accumulate from doing those good deeds are very limited. But if you do it for the sake of doing it, because deep down it's the right thing for you to do, then ultimately that has like to some extent unlimited merits. And so when I think about the people in this temple, right, and the people who show up to just try to learn to get better at and understand Buddhism, it's not necessarily because they're doing it because they're getting a grade or they're getting money or they're getting recognition. No, they just show up to do it for the sake of doing it, right? And so it's to some extent when you show up to listen to some conversations like these, it's not so that you can become more enlightened. Sure, that's the end goal, but it's learning for the sake of learning. It's exploration for the sake of exploration, right? And it is basically going back to the original analogy, being the seed and giving the right conditions to the seed, and you are the seed, right? And when it comes time to germinate, that when you arrive at that point where you have accrued enough wisdom to understand, then you just get to that path, right? It's like you don't get strong in one day, right? You have to lift weight over time, like many weeks. And then one day you realize, oh snap, I'm strong, right? It's the same thing with being rich, having stamina, right? You don't just go out, wake up one day, run 10 miles and be like, I have stamina. No. You start with 1 mile, then 3 miles, then 5 miles over the course of a couple of months, and then you have stamina, right? So same thing with here and showing up, and this is a metacognitive or explanation. It's there's no value to be gained. No one is actually counting anything, right? Because ultimately what the Buddha says is that the seed of Buddhahood is within us, but it's really up to us to actually create the conditions for us to actually gain the wisdom to walk that path of enlightenment, okay? And so that's why we are all here today. And that's it, actually. That is my conversation for today. Thank you, guys. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? My question is, did I answer your question, though? Well, yeah, sort of. No, because you asked, what was the precise question that you asked, which is, isn't it a form of attachment? Yes. And so, look.
Can you repeat my question?
Yeah, sure. She says, is a certain level of attachment necessary to engage in the work to begin with, which is do compassion work, do volunteer work, etc., right? And the best thing about Buddhism is that there is no absolute, right? That's why the Eightfold Path is called the middle path, which is basically saying yes, have a little bit of attachment, but don't dwell on it, right? The unfortunate part is the people who lack nuance and wisdom, they're just attached and they don't know how to let go, right? And so, for example, when I talked about attachment to past things, right? You can acknowledge it, but don't dwell on it, right? Just like attachment to good things you have. Appreciate what you have, but don't dwell on the fact that you have it, right? And don't hold on to it. Attachment to future thoughts, Yes, dream, but don't just don't sit on those dreams and don't be attached to it, and that's it, right? And finally, the last thing I spoke about was just like attachment to like other people's words and perceptions, etc. Right? The caveat and the nuance is feedback is important, right? So if somebody says like, oh, you're a mean person, right? And if not just me telling it to you, but everybody around you telling you you're a mean person, there's some truth to that as well. Does that make sense? So yes, it's like don't be attached to other people's words, but feedback is also just as important. So to answer roundabout way, yes, it's important. You need some level of attachment to be compassionate, right? All that stuff, but just don't. The idea is specifically don't dwell on it, right? It's not. It's attachment without dwelling. And that's the idea behind it. Or yes, you need some sort of I wouldn't say incentive, but stimulus to get started on it. But at the end of the day, it's what's right with you, right? It's what sits well with you, and being compassionate. And you ultimately have the choice. It's either be compassionate or not be compassionate, right? And then the choice is yours, right? And that's what Buddhism gives you, it offers you. Here's your menu of options. Do you choose to do it or not? Yes or no, right? But yeah, I would like to actually revisit that too. I wonder to what extent is it, out of attachment. Like for example, like the people who do the volunteer work, like they bought the fruits, they do the flowers, they cook the food. Are they truly attached to this temple? Or is it because they're just doing it out of the kindness of their heart, right? And it's just like a community that they belong to, right? But yeah, ultimately, the final thing is the work that they're putting in right now is the boat that takes them to the other side, right? But ultimately, when you take the boat to the other side, you have to let go of the boat as well. So people, ultimately will have to let go of this temple. We'll have to let go of even their identity, who they are, what they do, et cetera, right? Yeah, that's it. Awesome. Thank you. That's it. Okay. Oh, it's been recording the whole time. Nice.